The smell of burning reached the stairwell before the elevator did. When the cabin finally stopped on his floor, the metal was warm, as if a hot pipe had just been run through the shaft. Nikita dragged a cardboard box almost waist-high inside, thinking that someone must have been frying something with the door open again, and pressed the button. The light in the cabin flickered. The camera under the ceiling flashed red briefly and froze, as if it had taken one extra frame. At that moment, he did not yet know that this box would be the only thing in the apartment that would remain warm even at night, when the heating was turned off for maintenance. Hello to everyone listening to this story. Please write in the comments where you found it, and whether you have ever brought home an item with someone else's history, found at a flea market, a thrift store, or in a relative's attic. I wish you a peaceful but attentive listening experience. Nikita worked in a regular office, in a department where they spent all day sending letters, compiling reports, and arguing about deadlines. His salary was enough to pay for a rented room and monthly transfers to his mother in the small town where she lived after her stroke. The treatment cost more than he could afford, so in the evenings he turned his room into a small online studio. He hung dresses, shirts, and old jackets on the walls, photographed them, and posted them in an online vintage store. Buyers loved his accurate descriptions. He wrote honestly about all the worn seams, faded areas, and strange smells. This way, he felt he was giving back to the world what his grandmother, a seamstress, had once been able to do, leaving behind a notebook with patterns and the habit of folding a small bag of lavender into each item. This box came from another country. The ad said, "A mix of vintage items, no sorting," and the photos were blurry, but Nikita spotted several silhouettes among the pile of rags that could turn out to be lucky finds. He thought long and hard about whether he could afford this purchase, but finally decided to go for it. This month's utility bills had already been paid. His mother was holding on for now, and bohemian stylists were willing to pay 3 times as much for some of the dresses in that pile. He was more afraid of losing his home than he was of risking a dozen new items. The room was cramped. One wall was taken up by a wardrobe he had once picked up for free from an ad, the other by a rail with hangers. On the windowsill stood jars of buttons, a box of chalk scraps, and a stack of his grandmother's notebooks. Nikita placed the box in the middle of the room, cut the tape, and slowly opened it. A heavy smell hit his nose. Dust, dampness, the slightly sweet aroma of hairspray, and a subtle note of lavender, as if someone had tried to mask the age of the fabric with a familiar remedy. Underneath all this, there was something else, something indistinct, reminiscent of fabric burned by an iron many years ago. He began to carefully take out the items. The first layer revealed familiar objects: men's shirts with worn cuffs, women's blouses with missing buttons, jackets with worn linings. Nikita sorted everything into piles, mentally matching the styles to his clients, noting to himself what would sell quickly and what would sit around for months. Near the bottom, under heavy wool coats, his hand stumbled upon something lighter but dense. He pulled out a dress. It was long, ankle-length, the color of faded champagne. The fabric resembled thick silk that had managed to survive decades without turning into rags. The bodice had soft folds, a side fastening, and a wide belt. No flashy decorations, just the clean lines of the sleeves and a neatly hemmed bottom. The dress smelled the strongest. Lavender and dust were familiar, almost homely, but mixed in with them was the smell of old iron and slightly burnt thread, as if it had once been dried too close to the stove. Nikita ran his hand over the fabric and shuddered. It was warm. Not just not cold. It retained heat noticeably, as if it had been lying in the sun. He turned the dress over and looked for a label. On the inside seam, he found a small piece of fabric with faded letters. He could only make out part of the name of the old tailor's shop and the owner's initials, 2 letters that were all too familiar. He had seen the same letters for many years on his grandmother's sketchbook. She wrote her first and last name on the cover in the same way, with these two letters, writing them with the same slant. He squatted for a while, holding the dress on his knees and examining the stitches. The hem was sewn with a thread of a different shade, slightly lighter than the rest of the trim. This is usually done when you need to urgently shorten or repair something with the means at hand. In some places, the fabric was slightly darker, as if it had been exposed to water or smoke. On the left shoulder, he found a tiny round mark, like a spark or ash mark, but neatly trimmed around the edge, as if someone had once carefully sewn up the burn so that it would not spread. Nikita took his phone out of the drawer, turned on the camera, and hung the dress on a rail to take the first pictures. It looked different through the lens. The color was grayer than it actually was, and the camera's focus stubbornly jumped not to the fabric, but slightly to the side, to an empty corner next to the dress. He had to press the button several times to stop the image from blurring. In one of the photos, he noticed that the reflection of the window behind the dress seemed to show a blurred vertical shadow, although there was only a courtyard and dark silhouettes of trees behind the glass. He put his phone down and wrote in his notebook, "A dress from the 1930s, a tailor's shop with the same initials as my grandmother's. The hem was hemmed later. The smell of lavender mixed with smoke. The fabric is warm to the touch." He put a question mark next to it. He often came across things with a history, but usually they told the story of the past in clear language. Worn elbows, pockets with forgotten tickets, lining more worn on one side. Here, however, there was something else, something elusive. At night, as always, the apartment was enveloped in silence. The neighbors upstairs had long since gone to bed. The TV behind the wall had fallen silent. Only the refrigerator sighed occasionally. Nikita lay on the sofa, counting how many customers had already responded to the new ads. He thought that if he was lucky, the sales from this batch would be enough to cover the debt for the medicine and finally replace his mother's old bed in her provincial apartment with something safer. He was used to solving everything with material things. Another successful sale, another transfer, another purchase at the pharmacy. It was reassuring. Almost asleep, he heard a slight rustling sound. At first, he thought it was leaves rustling outside the window, or someone opening a bag in the hallway. But the sound was closer, softer, more like fabric, lightly touching fabric. He opened his eyes. The room was dark. Only the light from a street lamp painted a dim rectangle on the wall. Against the backdrop of this rectangle, a dress on a hanger swayed imperceptibly. The window was tightly closed, as was the transom. There could be no draft. Nikita forced himself to get up, walked over to the rail, and stopped at arm's length. The swaying stopped immediately. The fabric hung motionless, as befits a dead thing with someone else's past. He carefully touched the hem. It was still warm. A faint smell lingered on his fingers. Not lavender, but something sour, reminiscent of water from an old radiator. He wiped his palm on his t-shirt, stood in the darkness for a moment longer, and returned to the sofa, deciding to chalk the strangeness up to fatigue and nerves. The next morning, he noticed that the dress was hanging slightly differently. The hanger had turned a few degrees, so that the bodice was facing not the center of the room, but directly at the sofa. It was a small thing, but after the rustling sound in the night and the warm fabric, it seemed too deliberate. Nikita returned the hanger to its previous position, took a few more pictures, trying to ignore the camera's focus, and posted the ad. In the description, he honestly stated, "Smells of lavender, stored in an old closet, needs airing out." The response came quickly. A stylist from another city who specialized in retro shoots wrote to him privately. She said she had been looking for just such a silhouette for a future project and was ready to take the dress without haggling if he sent it in the next few days. Nikita felt a strange sense of relief after reading the message. Together with the prepayment, the dress could cover part of his debts and give him a month without having to think about new purchases. He felt the familiar fear for his housing, and his mother recede slightly. He spent the whole day between work and thoughts about the package. During his lunch break, he stopped by the consignment shop where he sometimes left his things for sale. The owner recognized him and glanced at the photos on his phone. She lingered longer on the photo with the dress. She said that the style was similar to those worn by actresses before the war, and that she had seen a similar cut in old magazines somewhere. At the same time, she noticed that the hem had clearly been hemmed by someone else. A different hand, as she put it. Nikita promised to stop by again when he returned from the delivery department and went out into the street with a list of things to do in his head. In the evening, he took the elevator again with a box, this time with a different number, addressed to the stylist. He carefully placed the dress at the bottom, covered it with tracing paper, and added a small bag of lavender out of habit, even though there was already enough scent. As he sealed the box, he noticed that the tape seemed to stick to a warm surface. In fact, the cardboard should have cooled down by then. He placed his hand on top of it for a few seconds. The warmth was even, almost human. Before leaving, Nikita checked the ad, payment status, and invoice number once more. Among the papers on the table was a copy of the receipt from the online store where he had bought the first batch of items. He scanned the list of items again. Coats, shirts, jackets. There was no dress with that description. The 1930s dress was not listed on the delivery note at all. This meant that it should not have been delivered to him, should not have ended up in his closet, should not have been sitting in a box by the door right now. He carefully placed the receipt under the glass of the nightstand, where he kept the strangest documents of his little life. Old tickets, his first letter from the hospital, a postcard from his grandmother with the wish to do things honestly. That phrase popped into his head every time he was tempted to embellish the description of a product or keep quiet about a hidden defect. He decided to be honest with this dress too, not to hide the smell, not to invent a beautiful legend about a ball and a tragedy, but the fact that this dress did not officially exist in the shipment bothered him. On the way to the parcel reception point, he smelled burning in the elevator again, even though there was not a single sound of cooking on the floor. The camera under the ceiling flashed red again too insistently, as if recording something important at the very moment when he was standing with the box in his hands. Downstairs, the courier girl accepted the parcel without a word and stamped the delivery note. When Nikita signed it, the ballpoint pen jerked briefly and left a tiny blot next to the letter of his surname. The ink stain spread across the paper in the shape of a small dress with an elongated hem. At night, he woke up with the feeling that the room had become wider. It was as if there was a little more air from wall to wall. He stood up and listened. There was no more rustling of fabric. The rail with the remaining items stood motionless. The wardrobe, sofa, table, everything was in its place. But in the other corner, where the dress had hung before, there seemed to be a lack of weight, as if a small piece of shadow had been removed from the room. Nikita tried to calm himself with the thought that he had gotten rid of a strange object and would soon forget about it, like any other item he had sold. He did not yet know that his own honesty and observant nature would soon make him not just a seller of someone else's past, but someone who would have to decide how much memory a single piece of fabric could hold before it began to move on its own. In the morning, everything looked almost normal. The phone flashed with notifications. There was a receipt with yesterday's stamp in the drawer, and the remaining dresses hung neatly on the rail. Nikita turned on the kettle with a familiar gesture, put down a mug, and opened the delivery tracker on his laptop. The line with the parcel was already highlighted in green. The status indicated that the shipment had arrived at the delivery point late at night, with a note about some internal resorting. The time in the column seemed strange, as if the parcel had arrived there before he had even managed to take it out of the house. The line was updated, the numbers crept along, but each new attempt to check the data returned to the same mark. A message from the stylist arrived a few minutes later. She wrote that she had arrived at the delivery point in the morning, but was told that the parcel had already been picked up with a passport. The recipient's column contained a surname that matched his own, but with initials that no one in the family had used for a long time. Only his grandmother wrote that way, signing her sewing patterns. The stylist attached a photo of a page from the shift log. In the line opposite his departure, there was a sweeping signature in old-fashioned handwriting, under which someone had put a small dot, as if leaving a mark from the tip of a needle. Nikita stared at the photo for a long time. There was a barely noticeable fingerprint on the margins of the magazine, like a greasy stain from cream or lotion. Its shape resembled the silhouette of a dress. A flared hem, a narrow waist, rounded shoulders. The nighttime silence and the even warmth of the fabric under his fingers came to mind. He quickly wrote to the stylist that he would look into it, and if the item was not found, he would return the money. It was important to him, not only not to lose the client, but also to understand how his surname ended up in the magazine in such a way that someone else had taken payment for his efforts on her behalf. He went to the pickup point during his lunch break. The route was familiar. Across the courtyard with the shop, past the bus stop, where someone was always complaining about the schedule, to a small room with a bright sign. Inside, it smelled of paper, dust from boxes, and cheap coffee. A young girl in a uniform t-shirt sat behind the counter. Her voice was usually drowned out by the general hustle and bustle, but today she was the first to look up when she saw his receipt. She said she remembered the package because the scanner had frozen several times on that particular barcode. She had to enter the data manually and make a note in the log. Nikita asked to see the recording, if possible. The girl hesitated at first, remembering the instructions, but in the end decided that it wouldn't violate anything serious. She led him to a small monitor in the corner, connected to the surveillance system. The screen showed a blurry image of the counter from the previous night. Herself, sleepy, scanner in hand, box on the reception desk. At one point, the image flickered, as if someone had run a hand over it. The time in the corner of the screen jumped back a few minutes, then back up again, just like in the tracker that morning. The recording showed the girl leaning over the box, scanning it, then irritably putting it down and reaching for the magazine. At that moment, something strange happened on the tape. The lid of the box seemed to rise slightly higher than it had been, and the cardboard arched upward for a split second, as if someone's hands were pushing it from the inside. Then everything returned to normal. The girl didn't notice anything, just writing numbers and letters, occasionally fixing her hair. Nikita felt his palms grow cold. He asked to rewind to the moment when the box was taken away. In the recording, a silhouette in a jacket entered the frame, picked up the box, and turned toward the exit. The camera did not capture the face, only the silhouette of the back of the head and a hand with a white spot on the wrist, resembling an old burn scar or a mark from over-ironed fabric. But that's not what caught his attention. For a second, as the man walked by, the reflection in the glass door caught the outline of a dress, softly outlined against the dark background, even though the box was closed and the tape on it was a solid strip. The girl behind the counter said that she had then spent a long time arguing with the scanner and had recorded some of the data by hand. She added that the strange behavior of the equipment had begun after a fire in the neighboring building, and since then, some packages had been acting as if they were alive in the system, sometimes appearing twice, sometimes disappearing, sometimes changing their arrival time. Nikita noted to himself that the smell of burning had followed him from the elevator to this room, as if it were drawn to specific boxes and documents rather than people. On his way home, he stopped by the consignment shop as promised. The owner was sitting behind the counter, sorting through a stack of old fashion magazines. When he told her in general terms about the dress that had disappeared in a strange way, her face seemed to pale slightly. She took an old catalog from under the counter. Inside were photographs of models in pre-war evening dresses. On one of the pages was a woman in a silhouette that almost completely matched his find. The same hem, the same bodice, the same position of the arms. At the bottom, in small print, was the name of the atelier, with the same initials he had already seen on the label and in his grandmother's notebook. The landlady said she remembered rumors of a fire in the theater for which costumes were sewn in this very atelier. Allegedly, one of the seamstresses locked herself inside, trying to save a suitcase with the best outfits, and was later found at the door to the fitting room with the keys in her hand. These stories always seemed too straightforward to Nikita, almost fairy tale-like, but now that he saw the coincidence of the initials, the burn marks on the seam, and the strange jumps in time surrounding one thing, a nagging anxiety arose in his mind. He didn't want to believe in legends, but items that weren't listed on the invoices still passed from hand to hand and left a trail of inconsistencies behind them. A new message was waiting for him at home. The same stylist had sent a photo of a local vintage store window she had stopped at on her way home. On the mannequin in the center was a dress almost identical to the one he had sent. She wrote that at first she thought the package had simply been intercepted and resold, but then she looked closer. The hem was sewn with a different thread, noticeably different in shade, and on the left shoulder there was a neatly treated burn mark. Nikita knew that such coincidences did not happen. It was the same dress. Only now it was somewhere in another city, with someone else's price tag on the chest. He enlarged the photo. The street, passers-by, and streetlights were reflected in the shop window. And one more detail, a barely noticeable, almost translucent spot behind the mannequin, slightly resembling the profile of a face leaning toward the fabric. The phone's camera gave off a slight glare, as if the flash had collided with something shiny inside the store. The line of observations became denser. Flashing cameras, time jumps in the tracker, signatures with unfamiliar initials, warm fabric, and now a shop window in which the dress appeared faster than the parcel could be delivered. Nikita opened his grandmother's notebook again. On one of the last pages, there was a neatly inserted newspaper clipping with a note about that very fire. The text stated that among the victims was a seamstress with his surname and initials, as on the dress label. At the time, he had considered this clipping to be just another document from his family's past, but now it seemed like part of a long chain where each new receipt, shift log, camera recording, and photograph of the shop window pieced together someone else's life sewn into fabric. In the evening, when he checked the tracker again, the status of the parcel had changed. Now the system claimed that the shipment was still in transit and awaiting sorting. The arrival time had been pushed back again, as if someone were leafing through someone else's life like a catalog and couldn't find the right page. The apartment became stuffy, like a workshop where the windows hadn't been opened in a long time. For the first time in a long time, Nikita caught himself not wanting to pick up a single thing until he understood what memory was being paid for with each sale. By evening, the smell of burning had become an almost familiar companion. It followed Nikita down the stairwell, in the elevator, even in the minibus, where it usually smelled only of rubber and other people's sweat. At home, the first thing he did was open his laptop and create a separate folder. He downloaded photos of the window display from the stylist, screenshots from the tracker, pictures from the magazine with captions, and scanned his grandmother's clipping about the fire. He laid out the printouts on the table, the way he used to lay out fabrics, the smooth ones separately, the defective ones separately. Here, the defect was anything that didn't fit into normal logic. He noticed a strange vertical line. On the receipt from the delivery point, the machine stamp showed one time, but next to it, In the shift log, another time was written by hand. The tracker's screen showed the time of arrival, which did not match the time in the text message from the delivery service. In the photo of the display case, the camera of the phone accidentally captured the reflection of the electronic clock inside the store near the price tag. The hands were in the same position as in his grandmother's old kitchen photograph, which he remembered from childhood. She had accidentally been caught in the frame when she was photographed in her Sunday best. Other people's documents and family photos formed a strange but persistent pattern. He caught himself thinking that over the years of working with vintage items, he had learned to notice such details better than most of his acquaintances. He could tell by the seam who had hemmed the bottom, a hurried housewife or a meticulous seamstress. By the degree of wear on the collar, he could guess whether the jacket had been hanging in the closet or worn every week. Here, the fabric was not clothes, but time and records. Each document seemed to have been stitched by someone else's hand, slightly crooked. His little skill, attention to stitches and inconsistencies, suddenly turned out to be more important than any educational certificate. This thought was the reason for the next step. Nikita decided to check how far the invisible thread stretched. He posted a new ad, very similar to the previous one, but with one difference. He indicated that the dress was not yet ready for shipment and was being fitted. For this, he used an old photo that he had not yet sent to anyone. He quietly hoped that by marking the item as not ready for shipment, he would slow down its strange journeys between delivery points and shop windows. Almost immediately after publication, someone added the ad to their favorites. A couple of hours later, a person with a short profile, no photos, and no reviews wrote to him. The message was strange and polite. The correspondent thanked him for the honest description and asked if he could pick up the dress in person, without delivery, as contact with the item was important to him. Nikita felt wary, but at the same time understood that only a personal meeting could give him a chance to understand whether there was a real person behind these glitches, or whether it was all limited to anomalies in the systems and glass. He did not arrange a meeting right away. Instead, he asked for clarification as to which account the person had found the ad on. In response, he received a screenshot of the store's main page. Among other items, his dress was highlighted, but next to the title, it said that only one item left, and that special conditions applied for pickup. Nikita had not set this status. He always deliberately avoided these tricky labels so as not to pressure buyers. The system itself marked the item as almost sold out. He couldn't sleep that night, and finally decided to take another step. He turned on his old laptop, which he had long used only for listening to music. He transferred all the files related to the dress to it: photos, screenshots, scans. He created a separate folder and gave it a neutral name without any mention of clothing or the atelier. Then he connected a small external hard drive, the same one where he had once stored the last photos of his grandmother. For a second, the thought flashed through his mind that he was somehow stitching together two lines: family and work, life and paper. While the files were copying, the screen flickered for a split second. The folder named Dress became darker than the others for a moment, as if an invisible hand had passed over it. The progress circle froze in one place, then jumped forward sharply. When the copying was complete, Nikita opened the folder and scrolled through the contents. Among the neatly arranged photos, he noticed one extra image. It showed his room, the rail by the wall, the table with notebooks, and the same sofa. There was no dress on the rail, although he knew for sure that he had never taken a photo of the room without any belongings in it. He enlarged the image. On the wallpaper near the rail, there was a faint, paler rectangle, the same size as the silhouette of the dress, as if it had just disappeared, leaving behind a faint imprint. In the lower right corner of the screen, for some reason, the system had stamped a time that did not match any of his recent actions. as if it were a frame from some invisible recording inserted into the general sequence. The alarm was no longer abstract. Before that, everything could be attributed to malfunctions, employee negligence, old legends, and coincidences. But the extra frame in his own archive, which appeared without his involvement, meant that someone had been using the same tools, cameras, trackers, electronic signatures, for a long time, as easily as his grandmother once used a needle and thread. For the first time, Nikita felt not only fear, but also a strange sense of responsibility. If none of the adults in this story noticed the flaws in the seam except him, then it was up to him to decide what to do with something that clearly wasn't going to lie still. He returned to his correspondence with the anonymous buyer and typed a short message suggesting that they meet, not in his building or at the store, but in a neutral place, the hall of an old library where an archivist he knew worked. There, among the shelves of documents and reports, someone else's memory always felt different. As he sent the message, he understood that he was consciously taking a step toward danger. It was not an accident, not just how it turned out, but his choice to call out the owner of the voice that edited not only the camera recordings, but also his own life. The buyer's reply came in the morning. Nikita saw the short notification while putting the kettle on. His interlocutor agreed to meet in the library, noting that he liked places where things stay on their shelves for a long time. This was followed by a polite request to specify the time and describe how to find him. The avatar was still empty, a gray silhouette, no photo. The letter looked as if it had been written using a template from an old business correspondence textbook. Nikita wrote that he would come to the reading room in the middle of the day and added that a female colleague would be with him. He wanted someone else to see what would happen next, not just him. He called the archivist in advance, whom he consulted from time to time about the catalogs. She had long considered him a strange but useful visitor, a man who brought old things and asked questions not about the price, but about the past. This time, he told her only half the story, about the dress that had mysteriously ended up in the display case, and about the coincidence of the surnames. That was enough to pique her interest. She said that such coincidences often occurred in cases of inheritance and donation, and suggested looking at the old inventories. The library greeted them with its usual silence and faint smell of paper. The hall was cool, and the glass door creaked slightly every time someone entered. The archivist was already waiting for him off to the side, wearing a badge on her chest and carrying a bunch of keys to the office. She was always perceived as part of the furniture, a quiet person in a cardigan who knew where to find the right folder, but rarely attracted attention. Today, it was her ability to quickly find old records that Nikita was counting on most. He brought the dress in a regular bag. The fabric inside weighed heavily on his arm, as if it didn't like being carried. Climbing the stairs, he noticed that the ceiling lights flickered a little longer than usual before coming on. It wasn't a sudden glitch, but a quiet, persistent one. It seemed as if the building itself was reacting to the object in his hands. He tried not to think about it, and focused on the simple steps. Go through the turnstile, sign the visitor log, indicate his purpose, working with periodicals. In the reading room, they were seated at a separate table by the wall. The archivist placed a thin folder with photocopies of old newspapers in front of her. She had already found a selection of notes about the fire in the theater and the very studio indicated by the initials on the label. Nikita placed his grandmother's notebook, the clipping, and his printouts next to her. He stacked them neatly, like a pattern before cutting. He left the dress in its cover for now, only unzipping the top so the fabric could breathe, as his grandmother liked to say. The first coincidences were almost expected. One note mentioned costumes sewn for the last performance and the seamstress's surname, which was the same as his own. Another contained a list of burned property which included several evening dresses registered under a gift agreement. The archivist pointed to the lines stating that the owners of the items had not had time to retrieve them from the theater and that their fate remained unknown after the fire. She noted that some of the contract numbers were not continued in any of the subsequent registers. With each new sheet, Nikita felt the object in the case grow heavier. It became slightly more difficult to breathe. The air felt thicker. At one point, he noticed that the fabric on the zipper moved slightly, even though there was no draft in the room. The archivist saw it too. They exchanged glances, but neither of them voiced the obvious. Instead, she took out a blank temporary storage receipt form. She said that according to the rules, such items could be registered as potential exhibits or research objects, especially if they were linked to documents. This was the very same unexpected benefactor. A small man with keys and access to the back rooms, who usually went unnoticed, suddenly had the opportunity to change the course of a strange story. Not with spells or loud statements, but with a neatly filled-out form and an official signature. Nikita only had to decide whether he was ready to give the dress to a place where it would become not a commodity or a mystery, but part of a case with an inventory number. The answer to this decision was provided by the item itself. While they were filling out the form, a small piece of fabric slipped out from under the cover, a narrow strip like from a belt. There was a barely noticeable charred mark on the edge, but the material itself remained intact and soft. Nikita remembered his grandmother's rule. If an item does not lie still, it must be sewn to a place where it will not be touched. He realized that this was the moment when he had to choose not between believe or not, but between continuing to sell and earn money, or acknowledging that some things have a different logic of existence. He took a pen and carefully wrote down all the known details in the report: the presumed date of manufacture, the connection with the fire, the coincidence of surnames, the strange story with the parcel. The archivist was surprised to see how evenly he formulated the details without exaggerating or embellishing. She was used to visitors who either dramatized or devalued their findings. Here, sitting in front of her, was a man who was essentially conducting a mini-investigation and recording every fact like a stitch. When they signed the papers, the lamps on the ceiling stopped flickering. The light became even and calm. Nikita felt that the fabric under his fingers had also become cooler, as if the dress had finally taken on a new status. It was no longer going to be sent, returned, or resold. It was moving into a space where every item had a card, a shelf, and a number on its spine. At that moment, a middle-aged man quietly entered the hall. He was wearing a plain jacket and carrying a folder under his arm. He looked around, found them with his gaze, and headed for the table. Nikita realized that this was the buyer. His face was ordinary, slightly tired, his eyes attentive. He introduced himself as a researcher of theater archives and said that he had been hunting for items from the destroyed theater for a long time in order to restore an approximate list of costumes. He explained that he had found the ad by accident and decided that this was a chance to see a surviving copy. There was nothing mystical in his words, only dry facts. People really do spend their whole lives chasing after lost things, documents, instruments. But Nikita caught one nuance. The researcher mentioned details that he could not have known if he had not read his grandmother's clipping or held other pieces of the story in his hands. For example, he described the place where the suitcase with the best dresses was kept, using almost the same wording as in the old note. The archivist caught this tone and asked where he had gotten such knowledge. The man replied that he had inherited some of the documents from a relative who had worked as a seamstress at that very factory. This revealed a hidden connection that Nikita had not suspected. The old lists clearly mixed up the lines. His grandmother, who sewed clothes at home and worked part-time in a tailor's shop, and someone's aunt, whose papers were now in the possession of this man. Without knowing it, they had the same last names, worked with the same patterns, and perhaps shared responsibility for the fate of items that were not picked up on time. The archivist offered a simple and dry solution. She said that the dress had already been accepted for temporary storage in the library, and now, if the researcher wanted to work with it, it could be done through an official request. No purchases, resales, or shady deals through advertisements. Only files, records, and cards. Her tone was soft but firm. The person who was usually ignored had to be heard at that moment. The man was silent for a while, then agreed. He said it was even better this way. The item would be accessible to others and would not depend on private collections. Nikita felt a strange sense of relief. He had expected conflict, pressure, attempts to buy the dress at any cost. Instead, he felt as if someone had finally put an end to a long series of decisions made by strangers. It was not a miracle or outside intervention, but simply people who had used their small powers correctly. The dress, along with the ribbon and documents, was sent to a separate room. The door behind him closed softly, without a squeak. As Nikita left the library, he noticed that the smell of burning had disappeared. The entrance hall of the building was still stuffy, but without the intrusive smell of incense and ashes that had followed him for the last few days. Other items hung on the rail in the room, swaying obediently in the draft. None of them seemed heavier than the others. A few weeks later, he received an email. The archivist had sent a scanned card. The dress had been assigned an inventory number, the material and approximate time of manufacture had been described, and it had been linked to the fire and family documents. At the bottom was a dry note that the item had come from a private individual, whose relative had worked with similar patterns. Thus, the legend dissolved into the lines of the register. A story that could be told in whispers became something that could be cited in a scientific paper. Sometimes Nikita caught himself passing by shop windows with vintage clothing and automatically searching for a familiar silhouette with his eyes. The dresses no longer appeared there before the parcels arrived, no longer flashed in reflections, and no longer threw up extra frames on the screen. Instead, there were neat reports, receipts, shift logs, and camera logs, which at the right moment came together to form a clear picture. What was frightening was not that the thing had a life of its own, but how easy it was to continue selling that life without asking unnecessary questions. He became a little more cautious about what he took on. He looked not only at the cuts and seams, but also at traces of the past. Initials, strange notes, clippings accidentally tucked into pockets, not because he was afraid of a repeat of the mystical, but because he understood that every item already had someone's story and someone's price, which cannot always be measured in money. Sometimes justice is not about punishing the guilty or banishing someone else's shadow, but simply deciding to stop dragging along what has long been asking to be put on the shelf, in silence. He still kept the files with photos of the apartment. In one of the folders, there is still that strange frame where the dress seems to have been cut out of space, leaving behind a pale rectangle. But now, it is not a threat or a mystery, but simply a reminder that even the quietest things can speak if you listen to them. Not whispers from the darkness, but lines in documents that someone once carefully filled out and put away for better times.